Alright, so in today's video, we are going to be chronicling every killer's movement speed in the game and factors like add-ons and perks that can affect them. So, let's get into it with base killer movement speeds. Going from slowest to fastest, we have the Nurse at 3.85 meters per second. At 4.4 meters per second, we have Deathslinger, Spirit, Huntress, and Hag. And at 4.6 meters per second, we have Legion, Clown, Pig, Freddy, Leatherface, Doctors, Myers, Hillbilly, Wraith, Trapper, Twins, Blight, Demogorgon, and Pyramid Head. So moving on to perks and how they affect movement speed. The following perks universally impact every killer's movement speed in the same way. Those perks being Hex Noed, Play with Your Food, Hex Devour Hope, and Agitation. First up is Hex Noed. When no one escapes death is active, survivors suffer from the exposed status effect, and your movement speed is increased by 2, 3, or 4% depending on what tier of Noed you have, for as long as the duration of Noed is active, bringing your movement speed for the average movement killer speed of 115% to 119% movement speed. Next up is Play with Your Food. You become obsessed with one survivor. Every time you chase your obsession and let them escape, you receive a token up to a maximum of 3 tokens. Each token increases your movement speed by 3, 4, or 5% depending on the tier that you have of Play with Your Food, allowing you to move at up to 130% movement speed or 5.2 meters per second on your average run-of-the-mill 115 or 4.6 meter per second killer. Following up, we have Devour Hope, which at 2 tokens allegedly gives a 5% haste status effect 10 seconds after hooking a survivor for a duration of 10 seconds. Personally, it's seemingly impossible to even notice that the game doesn't give you a haste status notification, so I'm not sure if it actually even works. And for the last perk that affects movement speed, we have Agitation. So normally during the carry animation, your movement is 3.68 meters per second, or 92% movement speed. When using Agitation, anytime you're carrying a survivor, your movement speed is increased by 18%, which would make your carry speed around 4.34 meters per second, or 108% movement speed. Alright, so next we're going to be going over killers that actually have powers or add-ons that affect their movement speed. Wraith, Hillbilly, Nurse, Myers, Hag, Huntress, Leatherface, Clown, Spirit, Legion, Plague, Demogorgon, Oni, Deathslinger, Blight, and the Twins all have powers or add-ons that significantly impact their movement speed in some way, but we're going to be going over every killer here just for full clarity. So Trappy Boy right here, no matter what, always moves at 4.6 meters per second or 115% movement speed no matter what. He has no add-ons or anything related to his power that makes him move any slower or faster. Wraith, when uncloaked, moves at 4.6 meters per second, or otherwise the typical 115% movement speed. Walking while cloaked, he moves at 5.06 meters per second, or 126.5% movement speed. While in the uncloaking animation, he moves at 1.84 meters per second, or otherwise 46% movement speed. When he comes out of cloak, he moves at an accelerated rate of 6.9 meters per second, or otherwise 172.5% movement speed for a duration of 1.25 seconds with his Windstorm. Wraith has 3 add-ons that affect his movement speed, being Windstorm Mud, which increases his cloaked movement speed from 126.5 meters per second to 5.61 meters per second, otherwise known as 140.3% movement speed. Windstorm White, which increases his base cloak movement speed to 5.8 meters per second, or 144.9%. And his third being Windstorm Blood, which increases his speed to 5.98 meters per second, or 149.5%. Next up, we have the Hillbilly. He's another killer who moves at 4.6 meters per second, or 115%. His speed reduces to 3.68 meters per second, or 92% movement speed while revving the saw. While in saw animation, he speeds up to 230% movement speed. He has 2 add-ons that can affect the speed of his chainsaw. The first of which, being Death Engravings, increases his movement speed and chainsaw sprint to 10.58 meters per second, or 264%. The second of which, Doom Engravings, increases his overall chainsaw sprint speed to 11.04 meters per second, or 276% movement speed. Next up, we have the Nurse, who has a base movement speed of 3.85 meters per second, or 96.5% movement speed. While holding her blink, she moves at 2.89 meters per second, or 72.2% movement speed. While blinking, she moves at 13.33 meters per second, or 333.33%. She has a lunge movement speed of 6.16 meters per second, immediately upon coming out of her blink, and while fatigued, she moves at 0.96 meters per second, or 24%. Next up, we have Michael Myers. Myers starts out every game in Tier 1 of his Evil Within power, during which he moves at 4.2 meters per second, or 105% until he reaches Tier 2, which he will then move at the typical 4.6 meters per second, or 115%. While holding M2 with no survivor in your line of sight, you will move at 2.79 meters per second, or 69% movement speed. When a survivor is in your line of sight while you are stalking, you will move at 0.92 meters per second, or 92% movement speed. The following add-ons impact his movement speed: tacky earrings, jewelry box, vanity mirror, and Judith's tombstone. Next up, we have the Hag, who moves at a movement speed of 4.4 meters per second. She has one add-on that affects her movement speed, and that being Waterlogged Shoe, which increases her movement speed to 4.5 meters per second, or 112.5% movement speed. Following up, we have the Doctor. He moves at a base movement speed of 4.6 meters per second, while charging his Static Blast, which will alert him of any survivor in his terror radius. He moves at 1.16 meters per second. While charging his regular Static Shock that you would use in Chase, he moves at 3.9 meters per second, and he has no add-ons that affect his movement speed in any way. After that, we have the Huntress, who moves at a base movement speed of 4.4 meters per second, or 110%. When she begins winding up to hold a hatchet, she moves at 3.08 meters per second, or 77% while charging a hatchet. And after throwing it, she moves at a 3.74 meters per second, or 93.5% movement speed during the hatchet throw cooldown animation. She does have one add-on that affects her movement speed, that being the Shiny Pin, which makes her wind-up movement speed a little bit faster at 3.45 meters per second, or 86.25% movement speed. Next up, we have Leatherface, another 4.6 meters per second killer. When he begins charging his chainsaw, he moves at a speed of 3.45 meters per second, or 86.25% movement speed. Once he begins his chainsaw sweep, he speeds up to 5.29 meters per second, or 132.25%. If he happens to crash into anything during the duration of his saw, he slows down into a tantrum animation to a speed of 0.46 meters per second, or 11.5% movement speed. Leatherface has 4 add-ons that affect movement speed during the chainsaw sweep, 2 of them being positive, being knife scratches and the beast marks, and 2 that negatively impact his movement speed during the chainsaw sweep, being the depth gauge rake and the tuning guide, which both have identical effects on the speed of his chainsaw sweep. Next up is Freddy, who is another 4.6 meter per second killer, whose power in no way affects his movement speed, and no add-ons affect it either. Following up is the Pig, who is a 4.6 meters per second killer, and her power allows her to crouch, which removes her terror radius. And during the crouch, she moves at 3.6 meters per second, or 90% movement speed. When she does her ambush attack, she moves at 6.9 meters a second, or 172.5% movement speed. Moving on to the Clown, he's another 4.6 meters per second killer. Whenever he reloads his bottles, he slows down to 1.61 meters per second, or 40.25% movement speed. He does have one add-on, the Inner Souls, that increases movement speed during reload to 2.67 meters per second, or 66.8% movement speed. Following up with the Spirit, who moves at 4.4 meters per second. When she enters her phase walk, she speeds up to 7.04 meters per second, or 176% movement speed. She has 4 add-ons that affect her movement speed, those being the Amulet, the Zuri, Muddy Sports Day Cap, and Dirty Uwabaki, and Mother-Daughter Ring. Next up is Legion, another 4.6 meters per second killer, who, when in Frenzy, moves at 5.2 meters per second, or 130% movement speed. When in the Fatigue animation, when Frenzy ends, they move at 2.07 meters per second, or otherwise 92%. They have no add-ons that in any way affect their movement speed at all. Next up is the Plague, another 4.6 meters per second killer. While charging her vomit, she moves at 3.6 meters, or 90%. While holding the vomit before releasing it after it is charged, she moves at 4.4 meters. She has 5 add-ons that affect her movement speed while either holding the vomit or charging it, those being Iridescent Seal, Prayer Tablet Fragment, Worship Tablet, and 2 that both have identical effects, Alabanum Incense and Incense Ointment. Following up with Ghostface, another 4.6 meters per second killer. Ghostface is able to crouch very similarly to the Pig, but he can do it much faster and without having to do a lengthy animation to crouch. When he crouches, he moves at 3.6 meters per second, or 90%. Whenever he enters into his Shroud ability and begins to stalk while standing, if a survivor is not in his line of sight, he moves at 2.3 meters per second while stalking, or 57.5% movement speed. If somebody is in his line of sight while stalking, his movement speed becomes 0.72 meters per second, or 72%. Passively stalking with nobody in his line of sight while crouched, he moves at 1.8 meters per second, or 45% movement speed. And with somebody in his line of sight while crouch stalking, his movement speed is 0.92 meters per second, or 23%. Ghostface has 6 different add-ons affecting his movement speed in some way, those being reusable cinch straps, leather knife sheath, drop leg knife sheath, headline cutouts, Ulson's journal, and Olsen's wallet. Next up is the Demogorgon. He's a 4.6 meter per second killer. When you hold M2 to charge his shred, his movement speed becomes 3.68 meters per second, or 92% movement speed. When you actually use his shred, he accelerates to 18.4 meters per second, or 460% for the duration of his shred attack. He has one add-on that affects his movement speed, that being Rat Liver, which changes his movement speed while holding shred to 4.09 meters per second, or 102.35% movement speed. After that, we have the Oni, another baseline 4.6 meters per second killer. When he's in the blood absorption animation, he moves at 3.45 meters per second, or 86.25% movement speed. Whenever you begin the Demon Dash, he picks up into a speed of 7.82 meters per second, or 195%. Oni has 4 add-ons that affect his movement speed, those being the Blackened Toenail, the Bloody Sash, the Kanai Anzin Talisman, and Akito's Crutch. Next up, we have Death Slinger, a 4.4 meters per second killer. When he begins to aim down sight, he moves at 3.3 meters per second, or 82.5% movement speed. He has 4 add-ons that affect his movement speed while aiming down sight, those being the Gold Creek Whiskey, the Marshall's Badge, Jaw Smasher, and Wanted Poster. Next up, we have Pyramid Head. He's a 4.6 meter per second killer. When he presses M2 to begin charging his secondary mouse 2 attack, he moves at 3.68 meters per second until it reaches max charge. And once it does, he then begins moving at 4.4 meters per second, or 110 movement speed, until he either lets go or uses it, and he has no add-ons that affect his movement speed whatsoever. Following up with the Blight, he's a 4.6 meter per second killer who can break out into a rush and dash attack at 9.2 meters per second, or 230% movement speed. He has 3 add-ons, one of which negatively impacts his rush movement speed in the placebo tablet, and 2 that positively affect them in Bladed Rat and Bladed Crow. And finally, we have the twins. Charlotte herself walks at the normal 4.6 movement speed, but when she dispenses Victor out, Victor moves at 6.0 meters per second, or 150% movement speed. While Victor is charging his pounce, he moves at 2.4 meters per second, or 60%. The twins do have 2 add-ons that affect Victor's movement speed, being Madeline's Scarf and Forest Stew. And that concludes the beginner's guide to killers' movement speeds and perks and add-ons that affect their movement speed. If you enjoyed the video or would like to see more guides like this, then I would ask you to please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. It helps out greatly. I do want to push out more beginner-friendly guides in the future. I do also stream just about every single weekday as well at twitch.tv/AbsolvedLIVE. If you'd like to stop by and join us, we'd love to see you there. I do main killer on stream and do viewer killer build requests all stream long for anybody and everyone. Anyway, until next time.